And that's when I decided I'm going to murder my mother. I knew a week before she died I was going to kill her. And she went out to a party, she got soused, she came home, went to sleep. I was woken up by that. Came out. I walked up to her bed.
Did you know some of the vilest, most sadistic, most warped killers in history got away? Most of them you won't have even heard of. Some of them right now could be living in a town near you, watching you, stalking you, and if two hard-working former detectives are right, they're conspiring to plan your murder on the dark web. This is real. You'll hear about this underground group of modern American killers in due course, but before we talk about the present, let's look at the past. The New York Ripper murders. Many serial killers enjoy being front-page news. They thirst for attention, which, as you'll see throughout this video today, is very problematic for society as a whole. Perhaps no one has had more attention than Jack the Ripper, the unknown maniac that worked at a time when London was the center of the media world. His story has been told a quadrillion times, and it seems he may have inspired copycat killers. Between March and May of 1915, the Ripper came back to life, although he was now called the New York Ripper. He brutally killed two young folks in some East Side tenements of Manhattan. Only 27 years after Jack did his business in London, stories of the New York Ripper filled the American press, leading to angry mobs taking the law into their own hands. The Brooklyn Daily Times said there was a ghetto Ripper. People read that a lunatic was on the loose. This caused panic in every household in this mostly poor area. This new Ripper taunted police with letters signed Jack the Ripper, saying he would kill again at random. 100 cops were soon assigned to the case. What's shocking is the Ripper wrote the letters to the mothers of the victims. In one letter he wrote, "Dear Mrs. Murray, I really feel sorry for you, but when the excitement cools off again some evening after dinner, I'm going out to kill again. You must understand that I must see blood and cut flesh." So, Jack the Ripper, or someone like Jack the Ripper, chose New York City as his hunting ground. The press sold newspapers, while the public lost its collective mind. Soon, a news report stated, "Man mobbed as Ripper." It explained that a cop had to draw his gun to stop the mob from killing the man. Another story talked about a man who was seen hanging around outside the Lafayette Street School. 100 students chased him down. It was a delirious time, full-on mass hysteria. For Italians, the New York Ripper was never found, and things eventually calmed down. This next killer deserves a place in the serial killer hall of infamy. If there was such a thing as the Ripper's Ripper, it would be this guy, the worst of the worst. The Cleveland Torso Murderer. The story of this very real Ripper takes place around the southeast side of Cleveland, Ohio, in an area that was known as Kingsbury Run. That's why the killer was also referred to as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The killer gained his nickname after his custom of dismembering all of his victims, 7 men and 5 women, who were all found in pieces here, there, and everywhere. The hand that killed them obviously knew a lot about anatomy, just as Jack the Ripper had. As happened in London, the Cleveland Ripper chose poor, disenfranchised people as his victims. Modern researchers have called such people less dead because when they're dead, they don't matter as much as other folks with a higher social status. The Kingsbury Run area was then known as the Hobo Jungle, famous for its gambling dens, raucous brothels, vagrants, booze, and nightly punch-ups. It was one of the so-called Hoovervilles, depressed and often violent shanty towns that popped up all over the US during the era of the Great Depression. Still, the authorities did try and get this man. They even put Elliot Ness on the case, the leader of the so-called Untouchables that went after the illegal booze Maverick Al Capone during Prohibition. It was the sheer gruesomeness of the case that compelled the US government to send their best man. In September 1934, a woman who was in her mid-30s was found. Well, her torso and thighs were, which were reported back then as a rotting slab of human flesh, found on the shores of Lake Erie. 2 fishermen on Lake Erie later said they found her head bobbing up and down in the water. She became known as the Lady of the Lake after a young girl swimming in the lake said she saw a hand waving at her from the water. What's notable is that the coroner, Mr. A.J. Pierce, said there were signs of a preservative chemical on the skin of the victim. Where would one find such chemicals? You'll see soon. It was about a year later that 2 young men were found, each missing their head. One body had been drained of blood. Coroner Pierce said the cause of death was decapitation. The victim was later identified as 28-year-old Edward Andrassy, described by newspapers and cops as a snotty punk who occasionally got involved with prostitution and weed. The other body, which had signs of a chemical preservative on the skin, was not identified. Both men were missing their manhood. Notably, unlike Jack the Ripper, the mutilations happened while the men were still alive, but the decapitation part was given as the actual cause of death. This was utterly brutal, but cops believed the killer must have drugged the victims first. The Cleveland News at the time asked, "What fantastic chemistry of the civilized mind converted him into a human butcher?" In January, June, and July of 1936, more bodies were found, and the signature of the murders was the same. They were headless, and if they were men, were found missing their genitals. In September of that year, a man tripped over something while trying to hop on a train. He soon realized it was the upper half of a person's torso. When police were recovering the other half from a muddy pool nearby, 600 people turned up to watch. The case shook America. Still, the Cleveland Ripper, while arguably 100 times worse than Jack in terms of severity, was not major global news. His story was never be printed on thousands and thousands of newspapers or given the major Hollywood blockbuster treatment. Despite Ness's efforts, including 5,000 interviews, he couldn't get his man. He decided the best thing to do was burn the entire shanty town down, making very poor people even more desperate in the process. Even back then, such a hardline act elicited widespread criticism. Ness was made more furious in 1938 when the killer left 2 of his victims, or parts of them, right near City Hall, in clear view of Ness's office. This was an obvious taunt. Body parts were now being found on local streets. As one writer explained, they were literally tripping over bodies. In 1939, County Sheriff Martin O'Donnell arrested a 52-year-old bricklayer named Frank Dolezal, who was thought to be a potential suspect. He made a confession, which some now say was staged. Cops broke 6 of his ribs, after which Dolezal was found dead in his jail cell. That hardly sounded like top detective work. The press then wrote about a mysterious man they called Dr. X, an alcoholic physician that had lost his mind and, eventually, his practicing license. His name was Francis Edward Sweeney, a well-known member of an influential Cleveland family, and was the cousin to the U.S. Congressman Martin L. Sweeney. Francis was a veteran of WW1 and no doubt suffered from what we now call PTSD. He drank all day, often flying into blind rages. He was crushed by anxiety and depression. He also had nerve damage from a gas attack in the trenches. What's more, he'd worked as part of a medic unit which performed amputations in the war. After the war, he worked in a hospital. I think just this is enough. Let us know in the comment what do you think of this video, and if you want us to carry on to part 2.